Welcome everyone, Christine here with the discussion about the Dwarves, who are hopefully going to get a major rework in the Thrones of Decay DLC. In fact, I think that all of the races, the Empire, Nurgle, and Dwarves in Thrones of Decay do deserve a major rework. It's a different situation with Shadows of Change, but yeah, with Thrones of Decay, Creative Assembly really needs to deliver with that DLC. We will see what they do, but the Dwarves in particular are a race that hasn't gotten any improvements, any major improvements on the level of, say, the Greenskin update, the Beastmen update, the Wood Elves update, or the Warriors of Chaos update. They haven't gotten any kind of those improvements. So fundamentally, they are still, in many ways, the same race as they were in Warhammer 1. Sure, changes have been made with various patches, and we did get Forik as a free legendary lord for the Dwarves, which did improve them somewhat, but in a lot of ways, the Dwarves are a race that has, in a lot of ways, stayed the same as it has in Warhammer 1, and it is something that does show in a very substantial way. You gotta understand that, like with Realms of Chaos, Warhammer 1, which I did play through recently again, Warhammer 1 was a far more limited campaign than either Warhammer 2 or Warhammer 3. I also think that one of the things that does affect the Dwarves is the fact that for a long time, the AI was engaging in the Order Tide in Warhammer 2, but that was because of the Dwarves. See, the Dwarves, when controlled by the AI on any high difficulty, tend to do pretty well, but not when controlled by the player. But why is that? Well, because the AI gets recruitment slots, upkeep benefits, income benefits, growth benefits, casualty replenishment benefits that you just don't have as the player. But before I dive into those issues, I do feel the need to mention that what I think the Dwarves desperately need is a resource system similar to what the Chaos Dwarves have, because it fits in perfectly minus the labor situation. But you do have a resource in Oath Gold that could take the form of labor. So replace labor with Oath Gold, give us more Oath Gold through the campaign as the Dwarves, and that could work well. Also similar to the unit upgrades that the Chaos Dwarves do have. So a similar system to the Hellforge, which would fit in perfectly to the Dwarves. A variation on it, to be sure, but it would work pretty well for the regular Dwarves. That's what I think needs to be the biggest change that comes with the Thrones of Decay for the Dwarves when it does come out. We need that kind of resource system to make the Dwarves more interesting to play. Not even about them being competitive, because if you were to buff casualty replenishment, upkeep, recruitment, income, they would be competitive, but they would still be fairly boring. And that's one of the biggest problems. The Dwarves are just very, very boring to play at the moment. Because beyond the issues, you can make a Dwarf campaign play quite well, because they do have a pretty powerful option when it comes to their army. They do have good hero choices, be it Thanes, Engineers, or Runesmiths. Those do work. In fact, if the battle timer is set to unlimited, you can win any siege battle with just a Runesmith when you are attacking. You may not lose it at all. Doesn't matter how powerful the enemy army is. It would just take a very long time to be able to succeed with that. So Dwarfs can win. It's not like with Nurgle or with Singe, where you have a really miserable campaign situation. You do have good units. The vast majority of Dwarven units, from their basic miners to Dwarf Warriors to Quarrelers, are heavily armored units with high leadership, so they tend to do well in Outresolve. Also, the Dwarves do get early game artillery from Tier 2. Like, one of the things I do in Dwarf campaigns is I build a Siege Workshop, get 2 or 3 Grudge Throwers for the initial armies I'm going to use, delete the building, get an economic building, which you will need as the Dwarves. So it does work, but it is pretty dull, because the entire Dwarven roster, like, you never want to really bother with Dwarf Warriors unless you just don't have the ability of getting Quarrelers quickly enough in a campaign. But outside that, you never really want to bother with Dwarf Warriors. You want to get Quarrelers either with Grey Weapons or regular Quarrelers. The difference is that Quarrelers with Grey Weapons are better in melee, the regular Quarrelers are better against ranged. But Slayers are useless because they take a significant amount of damage in battles, and Only Ungrim with his own army has good replenishment for the Slayer, so you'll just end up taking devastating casualties with them. With the Slayers, even if you're playing Ungrim, you'll take significant damage. But outside that, Quarrelers, eventually you want to get some Iron Breakers, as well as cannons and organ guns. But everything else, the gyrocopters, the gyro bombers, the Slayers, maybe one gyrocopter or two just for harassing purposes in army, but that's about it. Rangers can work, but it will result in you having to fight more battles manually, which is going to be a problem in a dwarf campaign. So let's break it down piece by piece. The dwarf economy is not really good. Like if we look at Karazhan over here, the basic economic structure, which goes all the way to tier 4, only generates 200 income for 1200 gold. To give you context of what the dwarves are dealing with, they end up having to fight a lot of greenskins in their campaigns, for instance, or dark elves if you're playing Grumbrindle. And both the dark elves and greenskins can get far more money easier, like the greenskin income building costs 250. But what's worse for the dwarves is that their post-battle loot and income from sacking and looting settlements is weak. See, one of the things with factions, with races that generate poor baseline income, is that at least they can generate a lot of money from post-battle loot and looting and sacking settlements. This goes from the ridiculous, which is the case for Dark Elves and the Greenskins, which, by the way, have a good baseline economy, especially the Dark Elves because they can trade and all that, this goes from the ridiculous to weaker races, even Kislev, who, although Kislev has a really poor economy and they need improvement in that, at least Kislev gets a good amount of post-battle loot. Funnily enough, I'm going to say this, Bretonnia, yes, Bretonnia, think on this from a lore perspective, Bretonnia has a better industry, economy, growth, casualty replenishment than the dwarves. Now, in terms of casualty replenishment, I suppose that makes sense. Compared to the dwarves, Bretonnia just has a lot more numbers. But in terms of industry, that doesn't really make sense. I understand that the dwarves should have limited numbers, but I do not for the life of me understand how anyone can justify the dwarves, which are one of the richest and most industrious people in the lore, how they can have a poor economy. Now, if you do play a long campaign, they do have scalability of that economy through a combination of trading depots alongside refactories, because you generate trade resources for the refactory, and the trading depot increases your tradable resources produced faction-wide, and also trade tariffs. So the dwarves with trading partners can work in the very long term, but it takes a significant amount of time to do it. The problem is, the early game is the crucial part of any campaign. Doing well in the early game is so very essential for any race. On top of that, an economy is also based on getting a lot of buildings and building slots, crucially. But the dwarves have one of the poorest growths in the game. See, the control that the dwarves have compared to, say, Bretonnia, like Bretonnia gets a ridiculous amount of baseline growth and a ridiculous amount of control. Now, control is not a problem from a rebellion standpoint in Warhammer 3. It's an issue for the dwarves in particular, and they're one of the few races really affected by this. It's an issue because of growth. So if you have poor control, that affects your growth. If you have good control, that gives you a growth benefit. Not necessarily a substantial one, but at least you're not in the minus. And when we're talking about growth, typically speaking, the way a faction generates growth is through their main settlement buildings, unless they're someone like Nurgle or a couple of other races, but usually through the main settlement buildings. Unless you're the Chaos Dwarfs, that's a different discussion. But the dwarf main settlement buildings are pathetic. To give you an idea, Bretonnia's main settlement buildings at tier 3 generate 6 times as much growth. That is absurd compared to what the dwarves have and what they should have. Or just don't have the growth system at all, do it like the Chaos Dwarfs. That's what I think Creative Assembly needs to do. So you end up with more limited buildings, which restricts your economy, restricts your hero capacity, restricts the units you can recruit. Not that you'd want to recruit more than Quarrelers and Grudge Throwers for a significant portion of your campaign, and even if you wanted to, you wouldn't really be able to afford them. That's the problem. It's a combination of factors. Now, for their armies, while Quarrelers and Grudge Throwers are good, and you'll win the vast majority of battles, you're also going to be put in that situation where you're going to have to fight the vast majority of battles on your own, because you don't have any real way of improving casualty replenishment. Here are the ways to improve casualty replenishment as the Dwarves. You have 3 ways, and they're all pretty weak even together. You can get a Lord to a high level and get casualty replenishment for the Blue skill line for the Inspirational Leader. That's one way, that's 6%. You can unlock the Recite Ancient Grudges, which gives you 3%. And you can also get the Barley Field. Crucially to know, the Barley Field is not a casualty replenishment building, it's a growth building. And even then, the growth it's giving you is not really that great. So you have a race that grows slow, has a weak economy, and has expensive armies that can win battles, but you have to fight those battles on your own. Those are the essential elements that need to change in such a way that the AI dwarves don't become even more ridiculous. So when was the last time you saw the AI dwarves dominating the map as they did in Warhammer 2? They rarely do these days, because they just get overwhelmed by their enemies. Because even AI dwarves, while they can have some powerful armies and more plentiful armies and replenish quickly, they just don't have the resources to compete with, like, say, the Warriors of Chaos, Skaven, Greenskins, and others. And that ends up being a problem for them to deal with. Those are the essential issues: casualty replenishment, income, growth. On top of that, the recruitment slots are also fairly limited. You start with the baseline of 2, you can get 1 from commandment, some research, a building, but you do have limited building slots. The building is tied to the runesmith capacity, so you do want to get it, and it also gives you the iron breakers to recruit, so you do want to get it, but it's a tier 3 building. It costs 3,600. You're not going to be building these en masse, so your armies, every single army that you have, is very easy to take significant casualties and eventually lose them, and it's difficult to recover from those kind of losses. It ends up working in a long game, but in the early game, the pivotal part of any campaign, the dwarves end up being behind. Those are the biggest issues, right? They're boring to play, and they're limited in terms of their campaign potential. On top of that, their research tree is a bloated mess. There's so many things that are just not worth it. And even if you wanted to get it, like, dwarves can get a great amount of research rate. I have been pretty unlucky in this campaign where I didn't get any archivists or students by this point, but generally you get archivists and students, and those buff your research rate. But there's a lot of pointless fluff over here that you're just not going to bother. What you do in research, and this is what you should do in every dwarf campaign: get autonomy of the holds for that commandment to get that 15 extra growth, because that will give you a decent amount of growth that will help you keep going. So it gives you plus 30 growth if you have autonomy of the holds. Then oaths of loyalty, High King Authority, so you can get a decent level of control there. Or you don't even bother with High King Authority and just get heavy cornstones for 10 growth. And after that, what you're going to go for is volley fire, starting with levy, missile, warriors, ammunition wagons, volley fire, and then getting masterwork crossbows and renowned deadeyes. After that, what you do is you start researching down the Trungs line in order to eventually get Recite Ancient Grudges and get Grimnir's Favors to get those 2 extra local recruitment capacity. But this takes ages to do. Enormous amount of time spent going for that research tree, and a lot of the individual rewards just don't feel that worth it. And there's quite a few things that you're just not going to give a crap about. Like, oh, your gyrocopters can fire while moving and get 20% ammunition. That's worthless in a lot of ways. There are some good things over here, sure, but in general, this is what you want to do, because those are going to give you the best benefits. A good research tree is one where you have choices and options. Like, Chaos Dwarves do have those options, and because they have multiple resources, multiple research that the Chaos Dwarves do have, do use different resources, like, for instance, armament or conclave influence. That can work for the Chaos Dwarves. And you do get a variety of research options that all of them are pretty powerful and worth getting. And what you decide to go for, like that variety of playstyles for the Chaos Dwarves, is what makes them substantially better to play than the regular Dwarves. Like the question Creative Assembly needs to answer with this DLC is like, what's the reason in playing the Dwarves if you don't make them far more interesting and compelling to play? Like, they need to make them more compelling, or at least as compelling to play as the Chaos Dwarfs. That is what they're going to have to deliver, because although the Chaos Dwarf DLC is the most expensive DLC in the history of the game, or the history of Total War, it is far more interesting to play a Chaos Dwarf campaign right now than it is to play a Dwarf campaign. Also far less frustrating as well. Another thing that's broken about Dwarves is the forge system, because it is pretty broken. Like, what you do over here is you go over here, you get a bunch of oath gold, and you start forging items, right? And when you forged some items, like you need like 120, but at the very least. But when you start forging things, like you combine them, you get a green item, this will give you back what you just spent. And then eventually you get a blue item that will give you extra when you're recycling it. So you can get an infinite amount of oath gold. So your heroes and lords can be decked out to the teeth, but it is fairly boring and frustrating to deal with. Then there's the grudge system. The grudge system, fundamentally, while it was improved in some ways with Phoric, a lot of the objectives that come up in a campaign are still the exact same objectives that came up during Warhammer 1. So for instance, let's say a Skaven faction raids you, or a Khorne faction in this case raids you. You get an objective to raid them. The problem with this is that it's general purpose. You're not targeting the faction that hurt you, you're targeting the race that hurt you. So what happens when, say, Scarbrand raids me, but suddenly he gets wiped out? Because that can happen. Not in this case, but it can obviously happen in campaign. No, you'll still keep that objective unless I think every Khorne faction gets eliminated on the campaign map, which obviously can happen. But you may end up with grudges that you cannot resolve that are very easy to acquire and difficult to get rid of. The problem is also that you need to reduce the severity of grudges. And keeping a low level of grudges is important because of the construction cost, benefit, diplomatic relations, and control benefits you do have. You do absolutely need that control to get extra growth. So it is a really frustrating system, and I think grudges should be more meaningful. Of course, you can have a bunch of these smaller grudges, but after a point, I feel like they should expire, or you should have some way of resolving the grudges, like paying gold. Like one of the ways would be to pay gold into the system in order to resolve those grudges, because that's one of the ways, by the way, grudges are actually solved in lore, either for blood or gold. And yet you can't do that. It's always bloodshed with the Dwarves in Total War Warhammer in general. And I think like the way the grudge system is handled needs to be better. Also, there is the imbalance between legendary lords because of the grudge. Like Phoric in particular, although he is certainly really powerful, like he alone could probably solo entire armies, although he is absolutely really powerful, he also suffers significantly in his campaign, partly because of his starting position and because of those grudges that will hamper him, because you will start at and you will start with very close to angry at the beginning of campaign, and you're going to have to make your way from that in order to get to a satisfied level with grudges, which means your campaign overall ends up being slower because you pay more for buildings, you don't have the level of control, so your growth is hampered. That kind of balancing between legendary lords needs to be improved, very strongly improved, I would argue, between the various legendary lords. And also, it's not like the Dwarves have an easy time in their campaigns. Like, again, you can make it work, and it can be fun in the short term, but playing a long campaign as the Dwarves just ends up feeling pretty miserable, because you'll win. Like, at one point, if you play all your cards right in the early game, you'll end up dominating a lot of the map, but then you'll still end up having to fight a lot of these battles manually, which, when you know you're going to win the battle without really any tactics or strategy, just putting your quarrelers in a firing line and killing everything in sight, that's not really a fun experience, to be quite brutally blunt about it. That is really not an engaging experience, and I think that's one of the things that needs to be changed. In general, regards to Auto Resolve, I have my own issues with that, but certainly the Dwarves do suffer because of the way the Auto Resolve is, the lack of casualty replenishment. They don't have a hero that gives them casualty replenishment. They don't have research. Their buildings that give them casualty replenishment are insufficient. Like, the Chaos Dwarves showed us how you could have a faction with good casualty replenishment even though you don't have a hero for that. Well, you have Gordoos, but the Chaos Dwarves as a whole don't have casualty replenishment from heroes. They have it through research. They have it through the political system. Also, the political system, by the way, would make perfect sense for Dwarves, because one of the main things that defines the Dwarves in the lore is how difficult it is for the High Kings in the history of the Dwarves to get them working together. This is one of the main projects that Thorgrim undertook, and one of the things that really hampered the Dwarves in the end times was the political disunity after Thorgrim died, after he was assassinated in the lore. So I think like a political system would also make perfect sense for the Dwarves. On top of that, I would firmly argue that Grombrindal should not just be about fighting a campaign as Malekith, because, yeah, he has his grudges with Malekith, to be sure, and he should probably be doing something about that, but Grombrindal's role in the lore is to be the savior at the most desperate hour of the Dwarves. Right now, he's just playing in isolation over there, so I think, like, Grombrindal would work much better if he was a lord similar to Axiata. Like, he starts an area of the campaign map, you can fight over there, but he also has these objectives where he works to help the various dwarven factions. Imagine playing as Grombrindal and showing up to beat up Archeon or Norska as they're trying to beat up Krakadrak. Just an idea over there, but I think like a system similar to that would work very well for Grombrindal. So the political system, that kind of teleportation system, for Grombrindal at the very least, that would make a lot more sense. Thoric could also use the removal of the grudge, the removal of his objectives from the grudge book. Like, it's understandable why Thoric would focus on getting those artifacts. He does that in the lore as well, but it shouldn't be tied to the grudge meter. Like, it doesn't really make sense as far as I see it. Like, Thoric can be really powerful, but he's hampered because he needs to do those objectives to just lower the grudge meter. The rewards themselves are not meaningful enough. Like, the rewards, like, some of them are okay, but a lot of them, like, oh, you got some special runes. It's like, you want me to go all the way across the map to get some runes? Okay, that is absolutely ridiculous, but you do want to do it if you're playing as Thoric, and it ends up being fucking crap to deal with. Like, look at the rewards. Yes, some of these are really good, like the Cypher over here, the Metallurgy Cypher. Yes, that is pretty damn amazing, but like, look at these runes. Decent effects, sure, pretty good effects in some cases, but also some worthless. Ooh, minus 10% vigor loss reduction. When the Dwarves already have a pretty good situation when we're looking at vigor loss reduction. Keep that aspect in mind. They can do pretty well with respect to that. And it's just a rune that you only use in one army. Remember that aspect as well. Like, you only put this in one army. Sure, you can move it from army to army, but it's like there's some good stuff over here, but also some pretty damn worthless stuff. Oh, Sundering Attack for Minor and Longbeards. Hey, that's great. I mean, the only thing that's worth it here is the cooldown to rune magic, which is pretty damn powerful, to be sure, but there's also a lot of fluff as well with respect to that. So, redefining, rebalancing, rebuilding the Legendary Lords and their campaigns. Let me not even talk about Ungrim and how pathetic he is. Like, you don't even want to use Slayers as Ungrim. He needs better Slayer benefits, and on and on. I can keep going on about these issues, but they are major issues to deal with for all the Dwarf Legendary Lords. Their campaigns are badly designed. Those need to be rebalanced, improved, not be stuck in the mentality of Warhammer 1, because that's really where they are at the moment. And yeah, improvements to casualty replacement, upkeep, income, and so on. And growth, especially growth, needs to be improved for the Dwarves to make their campaigns better than they are. Post-battle loot also could use a buff. Like, it's a combination of adding mechanics, adding a variety of units. Like, they really need to give us a reason with whatever units they're going to add in the DLC, because we know they're going to add them. Likely a hero choice as well. Whatever choices they make over there, they need to give us a reason why we shouldn't just play with the Quarreler, Grudge Thrower, then going into cannons and organ guns. They need to give us a reason why we should choose differently. The only viable choice right now is to get a Ranger army, but you're not going to be building these en masse. You're going to build a couple with a Feint Hero for Snipe. That will work. But, like, outside of that, it's not really worth going for a variety. Maybe, you know, some Iron Drakes, 2 Iron Drakes in an army, but that's really about it. So the variety is lacking, and they need to give us an incentive to go with a wider variety of units. Unit caps, maybe, but we'll see how Creative Assembly does decide to handle it. But these are the issues of the Dwarves, the areas I think they need improvement, and how they can improve in certain respects. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.